Well, let's first, if you look at India, US is one of the largest trading partners for India. Around $81 billion of exports was the number that that stood at around 2024. And US accounted for nearly 17.7% of India's export in FY24. India has a trade surplus with US. Now, which are the products that we export the most to the US market? Firstly, it's electrical machineries and equipments, around $14 billion in CY24. And apart from that, it's pharma products. The Welspun Living number is not right, but it's pharma products, and it's around 12.5. Precious metals around 11.6. Nuclear reactors 6.8, and organic chemicals around 3.5 billion US dollars. And if you look at the sector-wise impact, auto and auto ancillaries could stand to impact the most. Sona BLW has a revenue exposure of nearly 40%. RK Forgings 27, Bharat Forge and Tata Motors around 23 to 25%. Samvardhana Motherson 18%. Balkrishna again 18%. Sansera, Apollo Tyres around 3 to 9 odd %. So these companies have an exposure, direct exposure to the US market. However, the direct impact on these companies would be difficult to predict at this point of time, given the fact that they also have plants in other regions. So they could mitigate the impact of this 25% tariff that has come in. But the other sector that gets impacted the most is pharma. Now, there is still no clarity whether pharma will have a 25% tariff or not, because there's an ongoing investigation as well. An outcome of that is yet to come in. But these are the companies that have the highest exposure to the US market. Gland Pharma, Aurobindo Pharma 50% exposure, Dr. Reddy's Zydus Life 45% exposure, Lupin has an exposure of 38%, followed by companies like Glenmark, Sun Pharma, Cipla, which have an exposure of anywhere between 28 to 35%, and Torrent Pharma has the least exposure of just 9 odd %. Now, chemical companies, if you look at, these companies have a significant exposure. UPL has an exposure from 22 to 25%, SRF has an exposure of 20%, Jubilant Ingredient has an exposure of 9%. But apart from that, there are various other companies. Now, the direct exposure of these companies are not known, but they have significant exposure to US, and these companies are Aarti Industries, PI Industries, Atul, Navin, Florin, Alkyl Amines, Deepak Nitrite. But again, analysts believe that the chemicals that these companies produce are difficult to make in US. So despite the tariff, the export or the import, US imports will not go down for chemicals, is what the analyst community believes when it comes to chemical names. Apart from that, sectors like textile, now that sector is expected to impact the most, given the fact that US accounts for nearly 28% of India's textile exports, and the other countries, other emerging market countries, have a few of them have seen a lower tariff. So these companies could get impacted the most, and the names here are Trident 38% exposure to the US market, Welspun Living has an exposure of 63%, and KPR Mills has an exposure of 19%, Alok Industries with an exposure of 45%, Himmat Singhai has an exposure of 83%, and Arvind has an exposure of 37% of the total revenues that come in from the US market. Now, a small sector which also has an exposure is the shrimp or the seafood sector. Now, the Avanti Feeds has an exposure of 14%. Apex Frozen Food has the highest exposure to the US market of 63%, followed by Waterbase, around 40 odd % of exposure to the US market. Now, if you look at the consumer companies, largely most of them are insulated, but few of them have an exposure to the US market. LT Foods has an exposure of 39%, KRBL 10%, Tata Consumer Products around 12% of exposure to the market. Now, if you look at the renewable energy side, there are only a couple of companies that have an exposure. Wari and Premier. Wari has an exposure of around 57% of its order book is coming from the US market. Premier Energies exposure currently is just 1%, but they had plans to set up a plant in US, so that could get impacted because exactly here, as it mentions, their US expansion plan is underway, so that could get impacted for Premier Energies. Now, when it comes to oil and gas, now there is no direct exposure, but given the fact that Trump has also made comment on India importing crude from Russia, so that could have an impact on Reliance Industries and the oil marketing companies like IOCL, BPCL and HPCL, because nearly 35 to 40% of these companies' crude requirement are sourced from Russia. And from Russia, we usually get a discount of around $3 per barrel. And if they need to shift their source of crude, then obviously this discount will go away, and this $3 per barrel impact could have a direct impact on the marketing margins and the refining margins. Now, analysts expect that for Reliance Industries, the EBITDA impact will be around 3 odd %, and for the oil marketing companies, the impact could be as high as 10% currently. Now, there are few sectors which are actually not exposed to the US market. In fact, they are insulated. To list them, firstly, it's IT services. Now, they can have an indirect impact if there's an INR depreciation, but direct impact, there won't be any much of an impact for the IT companies. For FMCG, most of them do not have any exposure to the US market. Telecom companies have zero exposure to the US market. Real estate, again, zero exposure to the US market. Banks, insurance, power, steel companies, there are tariffs, but then none of the steel companies in India export any products to the US market. So again, zero exposure. And capital capital goods like L&T also have no exposure to the US market. So these companies largely stand to not see any negative impact coming in from these tariffs that have been imposed by US.